Thank you very much for, terrific. Thank you so much. It's now my absolute delight to introduce a colleague of mine who is a faculty friend of ISLA and really my first friend on the faculty at Baruch, Professor Elena Martínez. Elena Martínez is a professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature. She's also at the CUNY Graduate Center as well as Baruch College. She is a former chair of her department and a dedicated professor, and we are so delighted to have her here today to be the host for this evening. So Elena, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, so much for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank all the organizers. A special thanks to Daniela Toribio for all her hard work and for answering my many questions about the event. Also, a special thanks to Hedy Fight for her support of all Latin American programs at Baruch. I thank the Women History Month planning and all the organizers at Baruch. And I thank ISLA for your hard work and for promoting the study of Latin American and the Caribbean at Baruch. I'm delighted that my colleagues, Professor Esther Allen, and especially we are very fortunate to have Professor CUNY Distinguished Professor Paul Julian Smith joining us tonight. And I'm delighted to host this conversation with both Professor Allen and CUNY Distinguished Professor Paul Julian Smith. At Baruch, many of you know that I teach the Latin American and Caribbean literature courses. This semester I am teaching contemporary Mexican literature and also the city in Latin American literature. And I'm very excited to see that many of my students are here this evening. So thank you for joining us and welcome everyone. Next semester, I will be teaching Latin American women writers and also Afro-Caribbean literature course. These courses are usually very popular among students, and in these courses we discuss the themes, the language, literary techniques, also in conjunction with issues of feminism, issues of gender, and also social movements, especially LGBTQ movements in the region. Those courses, my courses, will be offered Tuesdays and Thursdays. If anyone would like to have more information, you can always email me. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Esther Allen, who is director of Baruch Sidney Harman Writer in Residence Program, a professor in the Modern Languages Department. She coordinates Baruch minor in Spanish English translation. Allen is a two-time recipient of National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowships and was a 2009-2010 fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. Her translation of Sama by Antonio Di Benedetto won the 2017 National Translation Award. And in 2018-2019, she was a Guggenheim Fellow. Her translation of Di Benedetto's The Silenciary is forthcoming this fall. Among her previous translations are The Book of Lamentations by Rosario Castellanos, published by Penguin Modern Classics. Welcome, Esther. Also, Professor Paul Julian Smith, a fellow of the British Academy, has been distinguished professor in the Latin American, Iberian, and Latino cultures and the comparative literature program at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York since 2010. He was previously the professor of Spanish in the University of Cambridge. His PhD is in Golden Age Spanish literature, but his field is now Spanish and Mexican media, especially film, television, and streaming internet. He is the author of 21 books, including the first book in English on Pedro Almodóvar, and a BFI Modern Classic volume on Amores Perros. He has been a pioneer of LGBTQ studies, from loss of desire, questions of homosexuality in Spanish literature and film, published in 1992, to Queer Mexico, cinema and television since 2010, published in 2017. His most recent books are Television Drama in Spain and Latin America, 2018, and Multi-Platform Media in Mexico, 2019. His books have been translated into Spanish, Chinese, and Turkish. He has published more than 100 academic articles, has given over 100 invited lectures and conference papers, and was a columnist for Film Quarterly and contributor to Sight and Sound. He was a juror at the Morelia International Film Festival in 2008 and at the San Sebastian International Film Festival in 2013. Welcome, Professor Smith. It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, we would like to start with a clip from the Netflix series, Juana Inés. Professor Smith, would you like to share the clip?
I sent the URL. I don't have it open at the moment.
Okay. Then Daniela, are you here to open the clip?
Or Jessica, do you have the clip?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna drop the link right now. Sorry, I'm having like technical issues, but I got it through. So I'm gonna copy and paste this. So I think the link is broken on my end. I'm trying to see if it's me.
Professor Smith, do you have it? Because I allowed you to share your screen.
I'm sorry, I haven't got it open. It's just a YouTube, you know, it can't be broken.
It's in the chat, the link.
Oh, okay.
Is it?
No, the link in the chat is the video for Elena Martinez's interview that we did for our course fair. It isn't the one for the I'm so sorry.
Well, maybe we should just look, if we have the PowerPoint, we could look at the images on the PowerPoint.
All right, and we'll work on getting the YouTube up.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, so Paul, would you like to share your screen? I think you can do that.
Okay, I'll go YouTube, sorry, share screen. Can you see? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it. It is in
So
full screen. It is in
No,
full
should
screen.
I put it
now,
in full screen and then?
Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you.
So I think we were going to have Professor Martínez and I were going to have a discussion about these are all images from the series, which was called Juana Inés. It's from 2017. It was shown in Mexico on free-to-air TV, which is important, so everybody could see it. And it was made by Patricia Arriaga. So if we're talking about overcoming obstacles, this is really important, that there's one of the most important TV producers in Mexico, and she struggled to make this series, and it's fantastic. And then it was put on Netflix, but you can see these images. And I began with this image because she's writing, Yo, la peor del mundo, I, the worst woman in the world. And Professor Martínez, I think, wanted me Would you like to say something about this?
Yes, I would like you to discuss the significance of the phrase. It's a phrase that was also used by Bamberg, the Argentinian filmmaker, to create her film. And it's a phrase that is, I know that many students are curious about this phrase. So would you please tell us about the
Yeah, it seems strange that a woman who is so important and so talented, why would she write this? And there was a kind of rhetoric of humility there, that she felt that especially as a nun, as a woman at that time, she had to show that she wasn't like big-headed. But also it shows how we depended on her writings and what she wrote herself under these difficult conditions. And so to say, well, what was she like? What was her achievement? You have to kind of move between her own writings, which are, voluminous and wonderful, but also what people wrote about her, what evidence there is. And so we shouldn't take everything at face value when she says that, because, for example, she's very strong in advocating the education of women and in saying, attacking stupid men who hate women. And so this is another thing the producer told me, is that Mexicans feel they know who Sor Juana is. For example, she's on a banknote. She was on the 200 pesos, and just a couple of months ago, it changed to the 100 peso note. And I was reading in Milenio, the newspaper, that people are paying thousands of pesos to get this 100 peso note because they're fans of Sor Juana. So she's a very kind of modern and active figure. And if she was the worst of all, how come she's so popular today? So this is, maybe I could just talk to it, or perhaps Professor Martínez would like to ask a question about the picture.
Yes. Can you please explain what is happening here? This is toward the end of the series. This is when Sor Juana got involved, taking care of the nuns who were ill during the pandemic. And this is all very relevant now. So would you please?
Yeah, I chose this picture, and I'm sorry, but it's very, as Professor Martínez says, it's very relevant now because there was a terrible pandemic in Mexico City. And the way the series works is it flashes back from the scene of scenes of the pandemic, of Sor Juana caring for her fellow nuns and also of her dying. And then it flashes back. And so the structure is flashback, which is quite common in bio series. This is another.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about the structure, the fact that the series begins with her death?
Yeah, it's kind of one thing the producer told me is that this is a series that is aimed for young women. It's and so she was trying to establish a connection with young women from the very beginning. And she said, if you don't have that connection in 2 minutes, they will change channel. It's old-fashioned TV, broadcast TV, but potentially with a huge, 120 million people in Mexico. And so that one point was to start with a very dramatic scene, that is the pandemic, but also to flash back quickly to when she was young. And a great deal of the series is the young Sor Juana before she was Sor Juana and when she was at court. One thing you notice about this is the beautiful costumes. So there is a quest for authenticity, and that some of these costumes really come from the 17th century. So it's extraordinary that women of that time would have been wearing these costumes. And the series does give you that kind of visual pleasure, which I think is important, but it's authentic. It's to make you think, what was it like to live then and to wear these kind of costumes? Should we move on to the next one?
What about the locations? Can you tell us about the locations where it's filmed, where the series is filmed?
Yeah, and this is another decision by the producer, was to use only authentic locations. Nothing is made in the studios. As you know, Mexico, they're huge studios, film studios, but she shot on location. She couldn't shoot in the actual convent of Sor Juana, but because that still exists, but it's very noisy. If you go there to the cloister, you'll discover there's a huge road very close by, and also it's a working university still. So it's very moving from the 17th century, still dedicated to education and to women's education. So they use this location is just next door, in fact, to it's a real place in Mexico City called Vizcaínas, which was a women's school. And so what's important here is to feel the weight of history and the fact that, you know, here we are in New York, there aren't any 18th or 17th or 18th century buildings, hardly. But my antecedents, the British, came here and they didn't build these beautiful things which still exist in Mexico. So to make you think about what was it like to live at that time as a woman and to be almost, I mean, it's a very heavy kind of architecture, isn't it? But these are the real buildings in which she was educated, in which she wrote.
Patricia
So next picture.
Patricia Arriaga has emphasized
Mhm.
that she didn't want to call the series Sor Juana Inés, that she just wanted to call it Juana Inés, because for her, it was not that important that she was a nun. She just happened to be a nun. What was important was her passion for learning, her passion for education. And Patricia Arriaga wanted to stay away from using the word Sor or sister Juana Inés. What about the visions that the series presents, the new visions that Patricia Arriaga puts forward in this Netflix series?
Thank you. So on the one hand, there's this idea of historical fidelity, you know, not just shooting in the place, but even wearing the same costumes that women wore at the time. And this is very important. On the other hand, she said, what is the attraction for modern women of Sor Juana is her rebelliousness. So there's something for you to think about, that she was a rebel, but also that there could be new ways of seeing her. And so what you see here is rather sacrilegiously a scene which was shot in the beautiful cathedral in Mexico City, but there is a kind of indigenous ceremony going on here. You can see an indigenous woman behind Sor Juana who is seated on the ground here. And so one new vision of Juana was to say that she was involved with indigenous matters. I mean, she wrote in Nahuatl, and she is shown protecting the rights of indigenous people. That was an important part of the series.
Yes, and that's something that is also very important for Rosario Castellanos, a writer that we're going to discuss a little bit later on when we talk to Esther, that interest in indigenous cultures in Mexico. Tell us about this image in here in which she's involved, she's in herself, she's totally into reading and writing.
I think this image is important because it's, as you say, it shows Sor Juana not so much as the nun, as the writer. There's a scene in the series where she caresses her books. She runs her hand along the spines of these beautiful old books, and you think there's a kind of sensuality in that, but also as Professor Martínez says, an absolute dedication to writing and reading and learning at a time when not so many women were even literate. And so I like this. This is her in her study, and you could see that the actress is showing the absolute dedication of her to the writing process, which I think is an inspiration to all of us. I'm just one thing that critics of the series said was she should have been wearing a veil at all times, and so this is when the producer said, I interviewed the producer, she said to me, no one would watch if she was wearing a full veil all the time. So you have to make compromises and think, well, what is the audience willing to watch? And a sort of rigorous historicity is not very helpful when you're making television and trying to attract a young audience.
Absolutely, absolutely. What about this image, talking about new visions and images of Sor Juana? Yes.
Yeah, so this was rather controversial with some parts of the audience. Not all were fans of edited together sequences where Sor Juana is with the vicereine, I think it is in English, that is the wife of the viceroy, and she wrote love poetry to her, and in the the series, there is a very beautiful romance. And look at the gorgeous costumes, and they're kissing outside. They've had a picnic. So of course, many people in Mexico, they loved this, young female viewers, and they were very excited to see the national icon in this lesbian context. But there was some criticism, and the criticism came from historians, first of all, said there is no proof of this, that there was a physical relationship, which is true, but also from people in the church who said this is an insult to a national icon. And I mean, this is not an insult, on the contrary. And actually, would you mind if I just read very quickly something the producer said to me? She said, Sor Juana was not asexual, despite the great effort of the Catholic religion to subjugate women, to turn us into a source of sin, to lock us up and put us in veils. Female sexuality in the court and the convent was alive and well. So what I like about that comment is that the producer, who is a woman, says we, and she's very conscious of representing Mexican women herself and giving a vision of a national icon which is intended for a female audience, a young female audience.
Yeah, there was a great correspondence, no, between the Visarin, but that correspondence has not survived.
That's right.
So what we have now is the poetry that she wrote for the Visarins, because Sor Juana was very well connected. She had strong connections with the colonial power, and she was writing poetry for different occasions, and she wrote poems for the Visarins in Mexico. And there are new interpretations, or pretty recent interpretations, of Sor Juana's life from the queer perspective and the lesbian perspective, especially the Chicana writers and scholars has taken this particular approach. What about any backlash from traditional viewers in Mexico, Paul?
Yeah, as I said, most viewers were very happy with this. I mean, I think it did get good ratings, and I say before, the important thing is free to air TV. You could just turn on the TV and watch it. You don't have to pay. I mean, I think maybe half of viewers in Mexico they don't have broadband at home, so they wouldn't have been able to see this if it had been on Netflix there. So generally there was very little controversy. I think there were just small groups of people, either kind of old-fashioned historians or people who are hoping to canonize her, to make her a saint, and they worried that this would not help their cause. But in general, that it is a series that did work for young women who were the target audience, and then was taken up by Netflix, so I had a global audience, which is really important, I think.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the work of Patricia Arriaga? Because I know that she has also produced other series centered on women. So can you tell us about that?
That's right. So her next series was called Malinche, and it was about La Malinche. That is the woman who was the interpreter of Cortés. And what I found fascinating about this series is that it showed the conquest of Mexico strictly from a female perspective. So you don't see big battles. You don't see, like the terrible massacre in Cholula or something, because Malintzin is going along with Cortés. And what we do see is a multicultural, multilingual society, because there are many different subtitles in different colors. So it's a little bit like the Sor Juana series, which is stressing Nahua as a language and the existence of an indigenous culture much later during the colonial period. But Arriaga is saying in Malinche, well, Mexico didn't exist, and there were many different groups of people competing, and they all excluded women. Women had to surpass many obstacles in order to find their place. And so in general, the history of what Arriaga is trying to do through this series is to give us a new account of what it means to be Mexican, but in a female key.
And Paul, going back to the phrase, I worst of all, or I was worst of the world, there is also the film by Bember. Can you tell us a little bit more about the film and your appreciation of the film? You have emphasized the sensuality of the costumes, and also if you can talk about the sensuality in this particular film of Maria Luisa Bember, I worst of all.
Yeah, I think it's probably less explicit in the scenes between the Vice-Reine and Sor Juana, between, they have this grill between them. So I'm not sure if they actually touch, I can't remember. But the Bember film, which is very well known, excellent, and I know that Patricia Arriaga saw it, the person who made the series. She consulted the film, she consulted all range of materials. Is much more abstract. It's very sort of light and dark, and it doesn't have a sense of the materiality of everyday life, of women's life in the 17th century, which is what Patricia was trying to give to a modern audience. So it's a fantastic film, but it's much more abstract in its aesthetic.
Yeah, the images are almost Baroque images in the film. I worst of all, it's a film of beauty, of grace, sensuality, also.
Yeah, with the chiaroscuro, it looks very much like Zurbarán, actually, the 17th century Spanish painter. And here, for the court scenes, Patricia Arriaga based her look on Velázquez. So the great painter, Spanish painter Velázquez, because if you go to Mexico, there are lots of portraits of viceroys. There are very few portraits of vicereines. There are far fewer women, and so she looked at sources for the Spanish court in order to illustrate the Mexican court at that time. But look at that beautiful dress. I mean, it was to be a rich woman with clothes like that. I mean, that was. Would have been a great thing. But on the other hand, the Sor Juana, that she gave up that rather superficial pleasure so that she could be free to write, which was, to a certain extent, she was free to write, which she wouldn't have been if she had been a wife.
What about the acting in the series?
Yeah, I think that one thing that they tried very much to do is to get the accents right. So the characters from Spain speak with peninsular accents. The actress you see here in the pink dress is from Spain. So they're very insistent on having characters don't speak in the language of the time. If you read Sor Juana's work, it's often very difficult, very complex. And although the dialogue draws on Sor Juana's writings, it tends to kind of suavizar, to make it easier for a modern audience to follow, which I think is necessary.
In your chapter, you study the Juana Inés series and also the popular, the series on the popular singer Juan Gabriel, which I found very, very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit more about studying both of them together? You are also an expert on telenovela, the series and the aesthetics of telenovela.
So I was actually in Mexico City when Juan Gabriel died, and he was a very beloved gay singer. So it was extraordinary to see this kind of immense national mourning around him. And on the same visit, I went to the cloister and I asked, where is Sor Juana's grave? And they said, we don't know, because she was just buried with all the other nuns. And I thought it was so sad that there was not, even at that time, that there wasn't a sort of public mourning of someone who was a great public figure, Sor Juana. But the background is that there were two series at the same time, biographical series, and they're both shown free to air to big audiences, and one was Sor Juana and the other was Juan Gabriel. And in some ways, it was a bit sort of daring on my part to compare the two. But Juan Gabriel was a an artistic figure in the same way that Sor Juana was. And also he had to be very careful how he negotiated his queerness. He never officially came out. And so there are similarities in as a public figure with Sor Juana, I think. But it was, as you say, it's sort of a little bit incongruous and shocking. But the point was that it was a time in Mexico when biographical series were first being made, just a few years ago, 3 years ago. But all of them are asking really, what does it mean to be Mexican? What does it mean to be a Mexican woman or a Mexican gay man? And can they represent the nation? That's what all these series are about, representing the nation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And now I'd like
Thank
to
you, Elena.
move, thank you. We will move the conversation about translation, issues of translation. And Sor Juana has been translated, her works have been translated by Edith Grothman, Electa Arenal, among others. Esther, will you tell us about Sor Juana's translations and your appreciation of these translations?
Thank you so much, Elena. And thank you, Paul, for that wonderful, beautiful series of images and disquisitions. And now I'm dying to watch Patricia Arriaga's series, which I haven't seen. And I just have to say, I'm a bit terrified to be talking about a figure of the Spanish Golden Age alongside an extraordinarily distinguished colleague who was trained in the Spanish Golden Age, which is why I've chosen the approach that I've chosen. But it's really an honor, Paul, to be presenting alongside you. And I'm so grateful to Elena, and I'm so proud of Stephanie for everything you've achieved, Stephanie, with the ISLA initiative, and I can't wait to see what you go on to do. So I have some slides to share, and I will go ahead and do that. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay, so before I get to Sor Juana, I'm going to digress through a different figure who I dare say is much better known to those of you who are listening to me. One of your contemporaries and compatriots, Amanda Gorman. And it struck me when I was thinking about Sor Juana, just how much she has in common with the figure of Amanda Gorman, who burst onto the scene this January when she was the youngest person ever to give an inaugural poem at the inauguration of President Joe Biden, but who had already, she was 22 at the time, but she had already achieved pretty considerable renown as a poet. While she was at Harvard, she'd been commissioned to do a great deal of this kind of public ceremonial poetry. And while she didn't, she wasn't quite as well known as she became after January 20, she had already very much burst upon the scene. And that, of course, makes her similar to Sor Juana, because Sor Juana too was an incredible prodigy who first won an award for her poetry when she was 8 years old. In both cases, Amanda Gorman is the child of a single parent. Sor Juana was an illegitimate child, a thing that was concealed for hundreds of years, actually, by her biographers, and only recently came to light. But obviously, in a time as traditional as that, with the rule of the Catholic Church, being an illegitimate child was marginalized her. And as Paul pointed out, she also grew up fluent in the indigenous language Nahuatl, and she used that for some of her earliest writing. And from that phase, she went on to get, we saw that incredible school in the image. She went on to get the best possible education that she could have gotten, as did Amanda Gorman, who went to Harvard through this early recognition that she received. So I would like to think of Amanda Gorman as a kind of Sor Juana figure, to bring Sor Juana home to us. And I want to start just briefly by discussing a recent controversy that has arisen, obviously after January 20, the translation of the poem by Amanda Gorman that she read at Joe Biden's inauguration all over the world became something that a lot of people were very interested in doing. So Amanda herself was involved in selecting a Dutch translator. She was involved in these issues all over the world. And the Dutch publisher proposed a young translator who was quite famous, having just won the International Man Booker Prize, the first Dutch writer to win the International Booker Prize, and someone who, while white, was gender non-binary, so had a kind of, marginal or contestatory position. And Amanda agreed and selected this figure. And we'll get to who that is in a moment. And at that moment, some controversy arose that some of you may have been aware of. A Dutch journalist named Janice Dull, I think that would be the pronouncement, was dismayed that a white person had been chosen to translate Amanda Gorman's work. Because, she said, Amanda comes onto the scene at this moment of Black Lives Matter, and this specific poem engages with Black traditions of spoken word poetry, and it was a missed opportunity to foreground the people in the Netherlands who are Black and who are working in spoken word poetry that connects up with the way that Amanda Gorman is working with spoken word poetry. And she quoted a Dutch spoken word poet named Quincy Garrio, who said that if a Black person had been chosen, they could use Dutch figures of speech that connect to the lived experience of Black women in the Netherlands, the same way that Amanda Gorman's work connects to the lived experience of Black women in the US. And of course, it was precisely to foreground that experience that Amanda Gorman was chosen as the inaugural poet. So the idea was that the Netherlands could do something similar to what Joe Biden did and use this as an opportunity to foreground the Black experience in the Netherlands, because there are Black people who live in Holland. The person who was chosen, Marieke Lucas Reineveld, the Dutch writer who actually was chosen, took these concerns to heart and stepped down as the translator of Amanda Gorman. And in fact, wrote a very moving poem about how Marike's gender non-binary, how they would not be the right person. The poem includes a line, because another person can make it more inhabitable, which I think is a rather beautiful way of approaching it. So Marike stepped down very gracefully to make way for somebody else who could connect perhaps better with Amanda Gorman's experience, but other translators were not as gracious. And Gorman began, once this issue had been raised in the Netherlands, she began looking at translators that had been chosen in the rest of the world through this same prism. And she asked Victor Obiols, the Catalan writer, who had been commissioned to translate her work into Catalan, to step down. She asked the publisher to have him step down. And Obiols was quite angry about this and said that he was a victim of the new Inquisition, and that he'd have to look for some shoe polish. And I'll leave you to imagine what he meant by that. What does all of this have to do with Sor Juana? Well, I think that there's been a lot of raging controversy around this, and I think one way of looking at it would be to look at it in the perspective of the translation of Sor Juana into English. So her earliest poem was written in 1682, which was 14. It's only recently actually been translated into Spanish, but that's because it was only recently uncovered in the last couple of decades. Oh, sorry about that. Didn't realize it was going to do that. And so Sor Juana also was working back and forth with different traditions, writing in an indigenous language when she was an illegitimate child of Spanish colonists, transforming herself into a Mexican. Sor Juana was also, as you saw in Paul's presentation, benefited from connections from powerful patrons. She was the protege of the Viceroy and Vicereina that you saw in the image from the Patricia Arriaga film. But not only that one, throughout her life, every Viceroy in succession became a patron of Sor Juana. She continued having that cultural power that was backed by political power, much like Amanda Gorman being chosen by Joe Biden. And it was one of the reasons why a woman was able to achieve the prominence that she achieved during her lifetime. As you can see, she's already being published in Madrid during her lifetime. This is 1689. She doesn't die in that pandemic until 1695. And this is at a time when publishing books is an enormously costly, expensive, time-consuming. Almost no woman would be published. And here she is published, not just in Mexico, but in Madrid itself, through the intercession of these very powerful political patrons that she has. And she would go on to be published extensively in the centuries that followed. Here is a 1690 Mexican text, again, during her lifetime. This is coming out in Mexico shortly after her death. More volumes of her work are appearing in Spain. So there is this vast body of literature by Sor Juana, about Sor Juana, that accumulates for centuries in Spanish, where she has this extraordinary reputation and this extraordinary authority. But if we want to think about her translation into English, I can't talk about her translation into other languages, but it's probably English that interests us here, since we're comparing her to Amanda Gorman. When do you think the first translation of Sor Juana into English would have happened? Anybody got any guesses? Well, any guesses from anyone? Well, it only took, well, this is an example of a missed opportunity. This is in 1892. This is one of the first translations of Latin American poetry into English in the United States in 1892. So we're already talking several centuries after Sor Juana's death. And this is a missed opportunity. It's a collection of Mexican and South American poems translated into English, published in San Diego, obviously a territory much closer to Mexico and South America. It includes only one woman poet, all the rest are men, and the preface mentions Sor Juana, but the book includes no translations by her. Indeed, Sor Juana would not first be translated into English until 1982. And as you can tell from the title of this book, what sweeps Sor Juana finally into English is the feminist movement. The idea that this is a woman of genius, the idea that we need to recuperate the neglected women of genius of the past. So centuries after her death, Sor Juana finally appears in English in 1982 in a translation by Margaret Sayers Peden, who is a woman, and certainly that's what's motivating this initial translation of Sor Juana, but who is not Latinx, who in many ways does not have certain key things in common with Sor Juana that we might now consider to be more important. But one of the great things about waiting 3 centuries, there's very little that's good about waiting 3 centuries to translate someone. It's much better to get translated right away, as Amanda Gorman has been. But as copyright expires and there's no longer so much money involved, what can happen is that you get a huge constellation of different translators, so that the text can be, you can see what it looks like when translated by a man, you can see what it looks like when translated by a teen, that is a woman a Latina and a non-Latina woman, a team of a non-Latina woman and a Latino, a Latino man, a Latina woman, and all sorts of different perspectives, different individuals can give you different kinds of insight into the work. And this, I think, is ideal, but when you're dealing with a hot property on the marketplace, like Amanda Gorman's, obviously you're only going to allow one translation because of copyright issues. So hopefully in 100 years or so, we'll see this kind of diversity in the translation of Amanda Gorman that we see in the translations of Sor Juana. And then just by way of closing, I wanted to mention that there's other forms of translation. Ilan Stavans has recently written a book about how Sor Juana is a pop icon in the United States for the Latinx community. And in this sense, I think we can return to what we saw with Amanda Gorman and the importance of an identity, a continual identity with the writer. This is a very recent performance done in Los Angeles by the radical lesbian Chicana duo of Ana Lopez Gaspar de Alba and Alicia Gaspar de Alba. They recently did a performance at UCLA's Fowler Museum in which they both adopt the persona of Sor Juana and make her into an icon of radical Chicana lesbian feminism. So yet another translation of Sor Juana, bringing her into our own time and to a community that takes her as emblematic and as a spokesperson of that community. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Yes, yes, there are other Chicana, especially Chicana writers who have also explored the works of Sor Juana and who have written plays about Sor Juana and her life. And there are many essayists, many female essayists who have written extensively on Sor Juana, and they see Sor Juana as a model and Sor Juana as an inspiration. For example, Rosario Ferre is one of them, and many poets as well.
We should mention, Elena, that there is a prize in Mexico, the Premio Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, which is only available to women who write in Spanish. And it's become an increasingly important prize. I think it's been around for about 25 years at this point, and it's extraordinarily prestigious. So that's another.
Yes. And that reminds me that actually Rosario Castellanos' novel, Oficio de Tinieblas, which you translated into English, the novel received the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz award many years ago. So it's an important prize.
Yes, it is.
I'd like to know if there are any other comments from Paul, from Esther. Anything else that you would like to add, Esther?
Are we going to be doing a Q&A? Or?
Yes, we have 5-7 minutes for a Q&A. Anything else that you would like to say before we go into the Q&A?
We can go a little over if you want to, if we have questions coming in.
Okay, great, thank you. Paul, anything else that you would like to say before the Q&A?
Thanks.
No, thank you. Okay, any comments or questions?
I actually have.
I just wanted. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, because I'll go last. Go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been an incredible and enriching experience, and I've learned a lot.
I'm glad, Janelle. I'm very glad. Thank you for joining us. Stephanie?
I have a question from Daniela. She wanted to know who were possibly Sor Juana's role models. Did she have because we think of her as this sort of pioneering person who kind of sui generis came out of sort of, because of her confronting these structures and limitations of her time. But I think I'm not sure if anyone has that answer, but who might have been maybe either in real life or possibly in fiction or in religion, who might have been Sor Juana's role models?
In religion, Teresa de Ávila.
Yes, Santa Teresa.
Santa Teresa de Ávila. Yes. In terms of literary figures, right now, I cannot think of anybody else because we have to remember that in the 17th century, the writers were made that were known were male writers. So
it's one of the extraordinary things, the degree to which she invents a role for herself that no one should ever have been even able to imagine that would be possible for a woman. No one could have imagined that the things she did would have been possible for a woman. So it's really one of the extraordinary things about her.
And she was really a public performer as well, wasn't she?
Yeah.
I mean, she wrote plays. I mean,
Yeah.
recently I was in Mexico City and they were about to put on one of her plays, so these are still performed, and unfortunately it was cancelled because of the pandemic. But so she's very vital, not just as a you know, as a poet and as a prose writer, but as a dramatist. And I can't think of any precedent for that, say in Spain. So I mean, it's interesting. Saint Teresa of Avila was very different in that she was a sort of pragmatic woman. She was out founding. She has a book called The Foundations. And Sor Juana was much more erudite, really. Although to get back to what we were saying before, there was this rhetoric of humility with Saint Teresa. She was constantly saying how humble and how terrible she was, even as she was doing these incredible things, and surmounting all the obstacles, which I believe is the theme today, is it not?
And I'm sure many of our students have read the reply to Sor Filotea in English 2850 and Comparative Literature 2850. I would imagine many of you are familiar with that text. And any other comment? I think panel.
We do. We have some hands that are up. Shall I read the names of the people who would like to speak?
Sure,
so the first
please.
one I see is Penel Somson. Would you like to speak?
Yes, hi, thank you.
Hello.
First of all, Professor Allen, I'm fascinated with your comparison with Amanda Gorman and the translation of Sor Juana. I'll be thinking about that for a long time. And Professor Smith, I'd like to go back to that yo la peor de todas, because it seems like there are conflicting views on that. In Octavio Paz's work, I think he thought that was really, you know, that she had really repented. And then it later came out that perhaps she was kind of forced into that in order not to lose her books. And so I think that becomes a very, very powerful thing, that moment. I saw both the film and the series. I couldn't see the series again. It seems not to be on Netflix in Mexico at the moment, but I can't remember, but I know that in the film, it was a very, very powerful moment, and that it did seem as though she were forced into that. Forced, but I mean, yes, forced, psychologically forced.
Could I just reply very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. And it's absolutely true. In the series, the great tragedy is not so much the separation from the beloved woman, it's the separation from the beloved books. When she has to give up her books, this is a tragedy. And I think, as you say, historically, it's not quite sure why she did this, but there's no doubt that the loss of the books, the loss of learning was a great tragedy for her.
And if I can just thank Penel for that question and point out to my class, my SPA 4004 class who are here, that Penel is a distinguished graduate of the minor in Spanish-English translation at Baruch, and who has gone on to publish a number of translations since she finished. So something for you guys to look forward to.
Thank you.
She's also a playwright.
And a playwright, yeah.
A playwright, yes.
Excellent, terrific.
I see another question from Tonia. Was there anybody else before Tonia?
There was Fanny Calderon and then Tonia Leon.
Okay.
So Fanny's next, and then Tonia.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Professor Elena, for inviting me to this Zoom. I find it very, very enriching, and it's a learning experience. I do have two compounded questions regarding her. Being that she was a prodigy since she was so young, does anybody know, or perhaps Professor Smith, may know if at some point in time has she been ever raised up for having a beatification or a canonization, because besides being a prodigy, I think somebody mentioned early on that she made some sort of miracle, or perhaps I'm mistaken on that side, but being that she was such a powerful, not just for her persona and for the work that she was done, but was she ever put into that possibility of being canonized or having canonization for that? And my other question, Professor Paul mentioned that there is no tomb where she is buried because she was buried along with the rest of the nuns. So as of this point, we do not know the place where she is buried. And so there is no place where to pay some respects, because such a huge image in Mexico and where people venerate her, and I've heard some, I find it almost unbelievable, but thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, all my knowledge of the tomb is just because I went to the place and they said, you can't come in. You have no business coming. This is a working university. And I said, well, I'm a professor at CUNY. I think you should let me in. So they let me in reluctantly because I didn't have any reason to go except just to see, oh my God, this is where Sor Juana lived and worked. And I asked someone there and they told me there is no official resting place of her. So I believe that's true, but my evidence is not very good for that. But when I interviewed the producer, she said the biggest controversy came from supporters of Opus Dei. Opus Dei are a conservative Catholic group who found Juana Inés's lesbian relationship with Vice Reine unacceptable. As I understand it, some groups are seeking the beatification of Sor Juana and this view of her as a woman and not as a nun with a deep religious vocation. As a woman. In the series, she's presented as a woman, not as a nun, which is what Elena said. This was not to their liking. So she blames the Opus Dei, who are, I believe, a powerful group within the Catholic Church.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, terrific. So we have one more question from Tonia Leon. Tonia, Professor Leon. Are you there?
Tonia, you're mute. You have to unmute your.
I will.
Okay, I'm sorry. You can. I'd like to thank you, the panelists, for their contribution. And I feel this is a great opportunity for the younger people to learn about this wonderful woman. I feel like she was indeed brought to English speaking world by the translations recently and by the feminists. There is, however, her main passion in life was to learn, was to read, was to write, to learn math and science, even though it was prohibited, censored, and she was threatened by the Inquisition. But truly, I think the way I look at her, her passion was not sexual. Her passion was to learn. I mean, were she alive today, I could see her as a young co-ed with a backpack full of books, bicycling to the library. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because when you read her letters, or even her poetry or her plays, you feel that passion and it's contagious.
Absolutely. We agree. The passion for learning is the most important thing in Sor Juana's works. Her intellectual quest is the most central aspect. Paul, anything that you would like to add about that?
The producer of the series said that the genre she's working in, the TV producer, is historical fiction, which would seem to be something of a paradox, historical fiction. So it's based on history, but there is always, when you're making a biopic or bioseries, a fictional element in that none of us have access to her interiority, what she was like inside. And so that has to be invented, and it is fictional. And I think that the point that the producer was making with the series is that women are sexual beings, and so that was a way of connecting with the young modern female audience. But she, as I said, this is just one vision of Sor Juana, and there will be many more visions of Sor Juana over the next 300 years. I mean, it doesn't stop now.
I don't see any other questions. Stephanie, do you see any other questions in the chat?
No, I think I think that's it. I don't see any other
Okay.
questions, Jessica. So I guess
Okay.
we can, I guess
Okay,
we
close.
can finish up. Would you like to
Okay.
finish up?
Okay. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you so much, Paul, for joining us and for your presentations. We really like them and we really enjoy them. And I thank ISLA and I thank everyone for attending this event. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Elena. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Elena.
Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
Esther. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.